Could you speak up, please? There we go. All right, we're on.
Are we on?
Yeah.
Everybody hear us now? Okay,
Yeah.
very good.
Awesome. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that. Thanks to everybody being here. So we have this Sunday and next Sunday, and we've got enough material for 3 Sundays in this presentation. So we'll try to move at a pace that will leave some for next week, obviously, but not leave so much that we won't get finished.
Right.
Does that sound like a plan?
That's good plan. Good plan.
So we continue our Old Testament foreshadows of Christ. I love that we came up with something that puts to rest these type things. Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament, because Jesus of Nazareth is not in the Old Testament, but Christ is in the Old Testament. Jesus in the Old Testament with all the different names, which hopefully as we go through and you're doing some reading along with us, you're seeing these names like suffering servant, the Messiah, the Anointed One, the Son of David, the Son of Man, all these different titles that Jesus has in the New Testament that we're familiar with that came from the Old Testament. And if we don't understand them in the Old Testament, we don't completely understand them in the New Testament, I would say.
That's correct. Yeah, we started with Micah 5:2 and Jesus, the Messiah, being born in Bethlehem. And so we've worked our way up to the trial. That's where we are right now. We've got our way to the trial. And
that's exactly where we are, the trial and crucifixion. So take it away.
We've mentioned just 3 of the trials. There were actually more than 3, but the 3 main trials were with before Caiaphas, then before Herod the Great, and then Pilate. Actually, Pilate before and after both. But those 3 are the ones we're going to talk about. And one of the things that's said is that Jesus did not answer a word. All 3 Gospels mentioned that. All the accounts mentioned that. But what it means there, and then all of a sudden you see Jesus say a few things here and there, but he doesn't answer their questions directly. The questions they put to him, he did not answer. He did not try to defend himself. He just simply made a statement about it. So
I think there's one more important thing to notice there. You brought it out. You know, he went to Pilate, and then Pilate sends him to Herod and to Caiaphas, and then back to Pilate. It's supportive of Pilate not being sure, because he wants other opinions. He doesn't want to just make this decision on his own. Plus, his wife is saying, "Don't have anything to do with that man. I had a dream about him." And then, he tries to wash his hands and say, "Hey, this isn't on me. This is on you." So the bookends of him make it interesting. It's his jurisdiction, and ultimately he has to go along with the decision, but he's not confident in it, or he wouldn't send it to the other 2.
Right, and it actually says that because he sent Jesus to Herod Antipas just happened to be in town for this situation, in the city for this situation, that he and Herod Antipas had kind of been at odds with each other, the Roman governor and Antipas. They ruled 2 different territories. The Roman governor ruled actually, in a sense, he was over everything, but Herod Antipas was the tetrarch. And so what happens is, because he set him over out of respect, or maybe because, as Stan is saying, he wanted some more comments about it, more opinions on it, it caused them to be friends again.
So what we're going to look at this morning here in Isaiah 53, and also in a few slides in just a little bit, Psalm 22, we're going to look at actual quotes that then get fulfilled or filled up to the utmost in the New Testament. Because here in Isaiah 53:7, it just says, he being the suffering servant, being the one who is carrying out everything, does not open his mouth. And of course, at that time, that was applicable to somebody, but it's even more so applicable to Jesus in the New Testament. So before Caiaphas, Mark 14:60-61, he just simply says to Jesus, "Are you not gonna answer?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. So there it is again. You have 2 different accounts of the gospel now saying the same thing. And then before Herod Antipas in Luke 23:9, he asked him many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. So this is like what was before, except even more so. Because don't forget, who was before in Isaiah 53 was the individual who all of those things were applicable to. God's anointed one, God's chosen one, God's servant. Jesus is all of those things, even more so than whoever had been before David, before Saul, before anybody else, right? Before any of the prophets. And it's applicable to him as well. He's in the same position, basically, that people before him were in. And then John 19, 9 through 10, before Pilate, but Jesus gave no answer. So we have all the gospel accounts saying the same thing. He's asked questions, and he just remains silent.
Right. He doesn't answer. He makes some comments here and there, but doesn't answer their questions.
John 19, 14, here is your king. Interesting statement, right?
Right. I couldn't find a picture of Barabbas standing there and Jesus. I was hoping to find one, but I couldn't find one.
So let's do two things then. You just made me think of something. One, this is an interesting statement because it's supposed to be mockery, right? It's supposed to be like, hey, here's your king, ha ha, he he. But in fact, that is their king, our king, everyone's king, the world's king, which they didn't know at the time. So that's one thing that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is mentioning Barabbas. It's always bothered me that when we get over into Acts and Peter's preaching and he says, this Jesus you crucified was the Messiah. And I've always, ever since as a little kid, I'm like, this Jesus, why would you say it that way? And people say, oh, well, that's a very common name. It's kind of like Bob or, William or whatever. There are a lot of people named Jesus, which is true. I'm not saying that's not the case. But back to what you referenced, some manuscripts have Jesus of Nazareth against Jesus Barabbas. Their first names were the same, which would now make the text jump off the page a lot more every time someone says, well, what do I do with the one called Jesus of Nazareth, Pilate says. Well, he wouldn't need to tell you the one called Jesus of Nazareth if he was the only Jesus standing there. And Peter wouldn't need to say, this Jesus that you crucified, if you wouldn't need to know which one it was if there wasn't another one. So I find that interesting, fascinating, quite frankly, that you brought up Barabbas for that point.
Right. Yeah. The answer given by some of the people when he says this is, Caesar is our king. Ooh, those people didn't believe that for a second. Although some of the ones that made that comment, it just wasn't true. They hated Caesar with a passion. So anyway, what we're going to do is take you through some Old Testament passages that fit Jesus, and you'll have statements made occasionally that these things were fulfilled or made full again.
Yeah, like this one. What's really, really interesting about doing this is it brings a lot of light on things that we've made important in the New Testament that maybe through our traditions and teachings, some of us don't even know why. If you don't have a great appreciation or understanding or close reading of the Old Testament and someone tells you, well, they stuck the spear in his side to see if he was dead. The next thing they were going to do if he wasn't is they were going to break his legs, but they didn't break his legs because he was dead. And you go, okay, well, that's good to know. Well, but it's more than just good to know. Not a bone would be broken, according to Numbers 9:12. And so that makes that statement even more powerful than just possibly someone thinking it's coincidence or good fortune that he had died before his bones were broken. No, it was actually that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, had already said that when this occurs in its complete fulfillment, no bone would be broken.
Yeah, you didn't break the bones of the lamb that was sacrificed, special lamb. You didn't break that special lamb, Passover lamb. So anyway, let's go back. And one of the things talking about the name Jesus being very common, why would that be the case? Because Jesus is the Greek form of Joshua. The name Joshua is Yehoshua. The short form was Yeshua, and when the Greek came along to make their translation of the Old Testament, they used Jesus in the book of Joshua. That is, it's called in the Greek Testament the book of Jesus. You see, so that name was both the Greek name for Joshua, and also a lot of people name their children Joshua.
Well, you just reconnected us to our Bible translations conversations we've had in here.
Right.
The King James, if I'm not mistaken, at one edition had the book of Jesus in the Old Testament, which freaked everybody out, and they had to go away from that.
Yeah, the word Joshua, if you look in your concordance, your King James concordance, it doesn't appear in the Old Testament. New Testament. It only appears in the Old Testament. And the reason is, in the passage in Acts and the passage in Hebrews, is talking about Jesus, which could be Jesus or Joshua. And so the King James translated Jesus both times. And of course, it was the Old Testament Jesus they were referring to, but it's confusing to readers that don't know that. Why Joshua gave them rest. Why Jesus gave them rest in the Old Testament times, it was Joshua who gave them rest. So I think Foy's looking right now. Am I right, Foy? King James Version? Oh,
Not a bone will be broken, so we're looking up from the Passover meal about the lamb. But it is great to make these connections, because it's not just like, oh, great, we learned some stuff. We learned some stuff, and then later we hear something and go, oh, wait a minute. I remember something about that, whether it be the bones not be broken or the name Joshua to Jesus to Yeshua. And so thanks for connecting.
And less than a sermon they had about Judas betraying Jesus.
Yep.
Predicted. We could have added that to this. We just had so many things to add to this. We didn't do that.
So moving on, the trial and crucifixion, more topics. Deuteronomy 21:23, the person is cursed that's hung on a tree, and that has really come forward. You probably aren't ready for this either, but it reminds me of another book I've read. The author is James Cone, who passed away just a few years ago. He spoke at Lipscomb during one of the summer series. He has a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. He goes back through the civil rights movement, and the innocent people, due to their skin color being lynched, he said were cursed and hung on a tree, similarly to the way people rejected Jesus. And I sat there and I thought, wow, I don't know what that would feel like, to feel like that rejection from the general population, and yet that pales in comparison to how Jesus felt, probably being rejected by his own people, by the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sanhedrin of his religious affiliation, plus his government, plus the everyday commoner that's making fun of him, saying, yeah, hail the King of the Jews. So quite a powerful image, I think.
Right. Very good.
And then you have Galatians 3:13 there. Anytime Dr. Cloud puts the little brackets in the New Testament passage, that's the compare it to. Compare Deuteronomy 21:23 to Galatians 3:13, and you'll see the connection. So here we go to, oh boy, we could have done a whole morning on Psalm 22. We could have just read it.
Right.
There's so much here. I mean, the first thing is the very first line. In English, it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? In the New Testament, I find it utmostly fascinating that what Jesus says from the cross, they don't understand. They hear it, and they think he's calling Elijah because of the pronunciation of Eloi, Eloi, right? Yeah. And so they make fun of him again and say, oh, look, he's calling Elijah, because they think he's saying Eliyahu, right? Which maybe they thought he just said the first part of his name. I don't know how you would mess up the who part. But nonetheless, they misunderstand what he's saying. What we believe, what Dr. Cloud and I believe he's saying, is in the Hebrew Bible, the books, as we've discussed in here, are not just single names. Like Genesis is not Genesis. It's in the beginning. So when he quotes, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's like saying, and now turn to Psalm 22. It's the name of the psalm, just like the first part of Genesis is the name of what follows. And so people would recall the rest of it, and I think that recollection is what we're trying to focus on this morning. Too many people, and this is just my opinion, too many people think, oh, well, that right there proves that God abandoned him. He turned his back on him, left him, totally disassociated from him. We get crazy descriptions sometimes, like Jesus became sin for us, which is true. The scriptures tell us that, and as soon as that happened, the Father couldn't have anything to do with it. But Psalm 22 doesn't say any of that. Psalm 22 actually confirms that all these cries out, God hears and actually responds. And so we should read the rest of it in order to understand what he's really saying, right?
That's correct.
Psalm 22, verse 16 says, pierced hands and feet. And of course, that one's pretty obvious. I don't think anybody would argue that. The only thing that I've learned over the years from archaeology is that quite possibly it's four nails instead of 3, because they were nailed through the side of the ankles into the side of the cross post rather than the crossed over feet with the little shelf. Not going to get in an argument with anybody about it, but no one argues that he wasn't nailed to a cross. No one thinks he was just roped up there or tied up there. So that one's pretty easy to see.
Did you see on Barr's blog where they found a person in Great Britain executed by the Roman soldiers?
I saw that.
And because now the only thing we have really example was there is a fellow who was crucified in Jerusalem, and that's in the Israeli museum. They actually have the nail going through the bone, and that's part of the exhibit in the Israeli museum.
Yeah, and BAR, in case you're wondering, and we haven't said it, is Biblical Archaeology Review, and you can look that up on the internet and get to the blog that has a lot of these discussions. And so Matthew 27:35 talks about him being nailed to the cross. So does John 19:18 and 19:34 through 37, and John 20:25 through 29. And those are all familiar texts that we know from being New Testament, people. Is that we would not question that he's nailed to the cross. We just might not have noticed in the Old Testament in Psalm 22 that person was pierced and nailed as well.
So we put all those in brackets because they're New Testament references that confirm what the Old Testament says.
And then Psalm 22, verse 16, they cast lots for clothing, that's why I'm saying if you just read a great devotional sometime, or even a communion around the table, is just read Psalm 22, because the scene is right there described. There's a slight little phrasing differences. Cast lots for the clothing and pierced in the hands and feet are pretty much verbatim. But you see those here also in Isaiah 53, 2 through 3, that's mentioned, not just Psalm 22. So we get the Isaiah 53 connection and Psalm 22. But it's in John 19, 23 through 24, and Luke 17, verse 25. And the picture there, I thought it was kind of neat to point out that there's dice on the ground. I don't know if you can see it from the seat. Yes, Jim uses dice quite frequently with some of his board games. But lots, we think of lots being who drew the short straw, which could be. But also it could be dice. When dice came about or what they exactly were, I don't know. I don't have the history of dice in my head. But it doesn't have to be the short straw thing. It could actually be more like, Yahtzee, where the guy has the cup in his hand and he's thrown the dice out on the ground, and it was decided that way.
Yeah, there were lots of ways to cast lots. In the book of Ezekiel, when they were approaching Amman, Jordan, which was called Rabath Ammon, and Jerusalem, and the king, Nebuchadnezzar, was not sure which he should attack first. He called in his diviners, his holy men, and what they did is they wrote Jerusalem on one arrow and Ammon on the other, and then I think they probably had some blank arrows, and put them in a quiver, and they drew out Jerusalem. And they called on their deities. Then they drew out Jerusalem, so they attacked Jerusalem first. So they really put a lot of faith in these kind of things, in casting lots. Of course, the book of Jonah, they cast lots in the book of Jonah, see, and God was there making sure it landed on Jonah so they would know that he was the reason for the storm.
That's exactly what I was going to say. 22 verse 16, cast lots for clothing. Another picture here, just a different artist rendition of what it might
You know
look
why I put this one in here? So they didn't want to tear the clothing and wanted it kept in one piece. So that's why when I saw this picture, that's what they're trying to tell people.
Yeah.
I believe that's what the picture was trying to tell people. They wanted to keep it in one piece. That's why they were casting lots.
Yeah, otherwise they would have just stripped it into pieces and everybody gotten a piece.
Yeah, and sometimes that meant it'd be like, taking a T-shirt, stripping, giving one half to one person. What good does that do you? So they cast lots for the whole thing.
But here's something that might be very obvious that we miss.
Okay.
They didn't do this for everybody that got crucified. I doubt. I mean, there's no reason to say that they did or they didn't, except that my hunch is the Old Testament told us that this person they would do this about.
Right.
I doubt every single, like the two thieves that are on the cross on the side of him, I doubt they cast lots and tried to say who got his clothing. They knew something was different about Jesus from anybody else they crucified.
Right.
Isaiah 53:9, grave with the rich, just succinctly stated, buried with the affluent or with in an area of wealth. And Matthew 27:57-60 tells us that Joseph of Arimathea had a brand new tomb that had just been cut and not been used, and he had the ability to afford that.
And the big scholarly argument was that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which also has a tomb that we go look at when we're in Jerusalem, or we also go here and usually have a devotional at this site. I don't think we've ever been on a trip to Israel we didn't go here, and they have different places scattered through the garden that you can have a devotional or worship service, whatever you want to have. And so, again, the weight of scholarship right now is that it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over this one. And there's even a book that came out about the argument put out at the Garden Tomb. But the point they make in the book and the point the guide makes with the Garden Tomb, this may not have been the tomb, but this looks a lot more like the tomb than the one at the Holy Sepulchre. The Holy Sepulchre doesn't look like a garden or anything like that. And so this is the way it would have looked. Whether this is the right one or not, this is the way. And here is a tomb that's only a short stone's throw from the Damascus Gate. It's unbelievable how close it is. But anyway, this is what the tomb would have looked like, something like this. This was a rich man's tomb also.
I remember a wise archaeology teacher telling me that one of the interesting facts about things built over there in the quote-unquote Holy Land is anything that was important, they decided to build a church on top of.
That's true. It was like when all of you went, probably only one trip I think I ever missed, going to the Church of the Beatitudes in Galilee. And that was the trip where my co-host wanted us to go find some other mountain close by, because we don't know which mountain it was. And it was a horrible experience at that particular place. But at the one that they built the church, so that's what happened when well-to-do people who were Christians came along, like the mother of Constantine. And they told her, this is the place where Jesus preached the sermon. Then they built a church building on top of it. That's what the Church of the Beatitudes is. It was a guess, but it's a guess based on what the people in the area had passed on down. It's a beautiful site.
Another site or picture of the tomb there that, like you said, you get to go in. And, I would bring David Cruz into this conversation that, one of the ways is there a seal that's broken? Because if there's no broken seal, that's probably not it, So, but I agree with what you're saying, and to some extent we may not know, and that is okay, or we might turn it into some sort of place of worship higher than any other place of worship, which God doesn't want us to do. Isaiah 53:12, numbered with the transgressors. And then we see in Matthew 27:38 that there's the thieves that are on both sides being crucified with him. So he's innocent, there's not any substance or basis for crucifying him at all, and yet he's put with people that there is basis and substance for crucifying them.
Yeah, I chose this one because it showed the two thieves. All the pictures would only show a part of one of them. It was just really interesting how I looked at so many pictures, and this drawing was the one that showed the two thieves on the cross. So
another interesting thing, I thought you were going to say something different. Another interesting thing about that is the women that are depicted there at the bottom, which we know Scripture tells us that there were women who stayed. I think we forget that unfortunately this is a public event. It's a lot more like hangings than what we do today with lethal injection, where it happens other than a news camera or something, nobody's there. It's a very public event that people either came and witnessed and waited until the person passed away, or realized it was going on and moved on. I mean, there was a different level of engagement with death by crucifixion than anything else.
yeah, and most likely it wasn't on top of a hill, even though we have a song that says so, because crucifixions, as a general rule, took place right on the highway, right on the main road. And those of you who've been to Israel with us to the Garden Tomb know that that is the right place. Then they take you over and show you a place that could be the place of the skull, and there's an Arab bus station there today. It's still on the road. It's the road that actually goes to Damascus. And actually, when you go outside the city, it goes to Damascus. And so that was a very common thing to do, was to crucify somebody on the main highway, so everybody and his brother could see what the Romans are doing. Don't disobey us. And so that's why it's like that.
Which, if we think about it, harkens back to the Old Testament again, with like Saul and his armor bearer, right? Or even though they're dead, do I have this right? He's beheaded and then he's put on display of being defeated. I may have two different stories in my head.
You talk about Saul and
yeah, he falls on his sword and dies because he doesn't want to be
oh
overtaken.
yeah,
But then they take the body and they basically make it a victory.
yeah, they cut off the head.
Cut off the head, put him on the wall for everybody to see.
At Beth-Shan.
Yeah, that's what I thought. You were looking at me like you're a crazy person. You're not remembering that wrong.
Wasn't sure for a minute, but he's right. He's got it right.
So we kind of started with this one for Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Is Psalm 22, verse 1. But then tell us about Matthew 27:46. Help me a little bit. I might not have pronounced it quite right. I know it's Eliyahu is actually Elijah, right?
Eliyahu's Elijah.
So if Eliyahu is Elijah, that doesn't sound like Eloi, Eloi. So what's going on there with what people thought they heard versus what he's actually saying?
Okay. What's your middle name?
Stanford.
Not Stan, is it? A lot of people shorten your name. I think what they probably heard was the beginning of Elijah's name.
Okay.
It's and they missed the rest of it, like that. That happens a lot to us. And when Juanita's telling me something, sometimes I only get a part of the deal, and I thought she said the opposite thing she said. And so, but the way it really is, we're not sure if he spoke it in Aramaic or in Hebrew. Here's the deal. Matthew's gospel puts Eli, 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 Eli. Mark's gospel puts Eloi, Eloi. That's Aramaic. It's exactly the same meaning. But it's like if somebody said, the Lord is my shepherd. And then I said, that's fine. You can also translate it, Yahweh is my shepherd, Jehovah is my shepherd. It's, in this case here, probably what happened, that's all really saying the same thing. I mean, you're not breaking any main rules. But really what it says is Yod He Vav He, Yahweh is my shepherd. Well, my guess is that Jesus spoke this in Aramaic. Eloi, Eloi, again, would be still similar to the name Elijah. But when Matthew quoted it, he wanted to go to the Hebrew. And so he took it directly to Hebrew. So we don't know which he did, but for some reason, Mark decided to write it in Aramaic. So someone says, yeah, but that's two different things. Well, how about a third thing? My God, English. you see, someone says, oh, he didn't say that. What he said was, Eloi. No, he said, my God. And nobody disputes that. It's the same kind of thing. My guess is that he actually said it in Aramaic, and because it says written on the cross in Hebrew / that word was used for both Hebrew and Aramaic. And then when Matthew quoted it, he went directly to the Hebrew text and quoted Eli, Eli. But all of them say, my God, why have you forsaken me?
So, thank you. Love that. And one more thing. Why do the gospel accounts have to tell us what it meant? Because clearly the audience misunderstood. And I thought of this yesterday. Last night I was watching some TV and there was some commercial that came on and they're making fun of contract stuff. And it says, yada, 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 yada down the TV. And I went, you know, from yada being knowledge in Hebrew. And I went, what if that's how that came about? What if the yada yada, meaning just verbally, like legalese and a whole bunch of fine print, but what if that's the knowledge of the stuff behind what you're signing or whatever? And so someone would have to say, well, what does yada, 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 yada mean? And then somebody would tell them. That happens in the gospel accounts. This gets stated, but then in our parenthetical place in the verses, it explicitly tells us what he said, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? So they heard something different, probably because that wasn't their language that they were accustomed to. They were either expecting it in Latin or Greek, maybe, and then they had to be told what he actually said. Did I make any sense in my question?
Yeah.
All right. Well, apparently that was a good enough answer.
That's
all right. 100 prophecies fulfilled by Jesus. You found this book or this information package from Rose Publishing. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, that's Hendrickson bought them out of business, but they still use the subdivision of Rose Publishing. And so you can go through 100 different prophecies.
And I love the jigsaw puzzle depiction because I think I've mentioned it in here before. There's a book called The Christ Key, which is saying that Christ is the key to the Old Testament, to understanding it all. And this is kind of like, hey, the last piece of the puzzle to put in on all the prophecies is Jesus. You put him in and then everything makes sense. And then you had a Knowing Jesus Through the Old Testament by Christopher Wright, no relation to Tom Wright. Christopher Wright, by the way, a great author, has probably the best book I know of on the mission of God called The Mission of God, which it's like, telephone book thick, but it's really, really good. He's the author of this Knowing Jesus Through the Old Testament, and interestingly enough, on the 12th of this month, so just last week, Knowing Jesus Through the Old Testament, a 3-volume or 3-part new book came out, and it's available also on Audible, which I'll show you the image of here in a second. But very good author. Would recommend if like me, you like to mow the yard or drive to Gatlinburg or whatever it is you're doing and listen to a book, I would highly recommend you pick it up on Audible. This is the contents of Knowing Jesus Through the Old Testament, a different cover that came along. I think there was a second version, maybe is this one, and your green one is the first version.
Yeah, I think.
But look at these titles. Jesus in the Old Testament story, Jesus in the Old Testament promise, Jesus in the Old Testament identity, the Old Testament mission, values, Jesus and his Old Testament God. Those are just inviting chapter titles.
Yeah, that's what we've been doing. So the last couple of weeks we've been going through the Old Testament and outlining Jesus. So he's got a whole book on it. And the Hebrew over there on the left is Jesus in Hebrew, or the short form of Joshua, Yeshua. And if you run into Jewish Christians in America at different places, they will say Yeshua, and then translations that less frequently quotes will have Yeshua in the translation. You've noticed that. That's exactly what it says over there in the Hebrew, Yeshua.
Yes. Somebody has a hat I've been tempted to buy, but then I'm not worthy to wear it, and it's a ball cap, and it has Yod He Vav He at the top, and then has Yeshua or Yeshua below it, so that you have both their names on your forehead, which is what Revelation tells us those of us who are in Him have. And I'm like, whew, I don't know, but it would be neat, except that only some of us, you in here and at home and you, would know what it says. But yeah, released September 12th, 2023 on Audible. If you have Amazon Prime, you can get Audible books included. Go out there and search on it, and I think you would be greatly blessed by it. So it's 8 minutes till. You want to start Hebrews 11?
Yeah, we'll do so. We decided our last study, which will be in a few minutes here, plus next week mostly, deals with, why don't we pick out some passage like the chapter in Hebrews, which deals with what? The Old Testament. The whole chapter 11 deals with the Old Testament. And that first, in fact, I'm going to use it in class on Tuesday night when I teach etymology and exegesis. This, I was trying to show in the first two verses, introduction here, especially the first part, what a deeper, the NIV translation appears all through this thing, except whenever we say something different. So that's the NIV translation. It's a good translation, but I just wanted to pick out a few of the words and say, we did that word study in here with you, and we tried to show you that faith was just some belief, or it's actually putting trust in, putting confidence in. And so I gave you some other things like hope. Most people, we showed you when we did the word study that hope really, the Greek word almost never means hope as we think of it. Oh, I hope I pass the test Monday, so and so forth. It means to expect, the hope of glory, the expectation of glory. So anyway, then I showed you another translation, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say before we left, I'm really glad you did this, because what you just said is super powerful. I think we get the confidence part. Now faith is confidence in. I think we understand that one. But when we get to hope, I'm afraid a lot of people read this as now faith is confidence in what we wish for, or on a wing and a prayer, hope comes along, or wishful thinking. But then and assurance, the assurance or conviction as you have it, that messes that up. That should kick back what we just said about hope and go, well, that can't be right because that doesn't fit. If you've got confidence and assurance wrapped around something that you think is a wish, you're not very confident or assured about a wish. But if you have it wrapped around something that's fully expected, well, then it makes sense. So your next translations, you bring that out. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for, being convinced of what we do not see. For by it the people of old received God's commendation. Yeah, commendation. Wow, yeah, I had it right, and then I failed.
Got the Hebrew right, folks. I missed it in the English.
Yeah, it's the English, yeah. Genuine trust is the solid ground on which we base everything we fully expect, and the conviction that what we cannot see is true. This is the very reason the ancients were commended. See, I got that one. That's really good. That's almost like you and I wrote
it. Anyway, I mean, that's one thing a paraphrase can do that a literal translation can't do. It can give you a feeling of the depth of the text.
Yeah, but genuine trust, a solid ground, fully expect and conviction of what we cannot see, but know that it's true. That's
real faith.
That's real faith.
Genuine faith, top-notch faith. That's kind of faith. This chapter 11, that's what this chapter is all about. Real faith, genuine faith.
We'll get to one of the exemplars of that which will have to be probably next week. But let's just go verse by verse. That's what we end up doing here. We start in verse 3. Well, we read those two, but back to verse 3. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. And then we have a picture there, I think, of the Milky Way galaxy, which we're in the middle of, or the sun's in the middle of. We're 3 rocks out from that.
Okay, go ahead.
Just the idea of just looking at something, I don't know how much time anybody in here spends in astronomy, but the things that the Webb telescope and the Hubble telescope can now show us, things like solar flares and other things like that, it's just such a, I don't know, I want to say volatile space, which I know it's not as volatile maybe as it could be, but to see all that power and all of that creation under control by God is kind of what this picture is trying to show. That's the sun as the earth spins, making it look like the sun rises. And then I loved this. You found this picture of mountains. That made me think of the verse where Jesus says if we had faith larger than a mustard seed, we could tell one of them to go throw itself in the ocean, and it would.
Right.
Haven't seen any mountains move in my entire lifetime.
Yeah, I just wanted to show you God's beautiful creation, how gorgeous it really is.
So by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. And by faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. And how does that work? Abel still speaks even though he's dead.
Well, this morning we're doing a little bit of that. We're referring back to Abel's faith. And
Yeah.
In that sense, you see it the other way?
Well, yeah, I think maybe we have it in here. Nope, we go straight to Enoch. So somewhere, and I'm on the spot trying to remember where it is. Trust me, I read it. I didn't come up with it. The blood of the new covenant speaks louder than Abel's blood. And we know in the Old Testament, Abel's blood speaks from the ground and calls out to God, and he hears it, and then he comes and talks to Cain. This scholar was saying the blood of Christ calls out in even more manner than Abel's does, in a better way than Abel's did.
That's very good. Very good.
Enoch. This was interesting. I'm watching the clock because that one's fast. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away, for before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And I put down here pre-flood. He's the only person the Bible tells us didn't die pre-flood, because Elijah comes along and doesn't die post-flood. But I hadn't really noticed that before. You've got all this stuff going on and the reboot that happens with the flood, but this man ends up walking closely with God and is taken and spared. That Adam dies and Noah dies, and Noah was after him, but you know what I'm saying. Everybody that's listed there through the genealogy dies, except for Enoch, the seventh from Adam, right? Doesn't.
Correct.
Well, maybe we should just pick up there next week because it's 10:59.
Okay.
Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, that sounds like a winner.
All right. Well, we look forward to seeing you next week as we end this. We also have several online, including Donna Johnson, who's been watching online, and we have some cartoons coming for next week. So specifically, mostly for Donna, but also for all of you. They were easy to find on some of the subjects this week, where some of the other matters have been so serious. There are no appropriate cartoons, but we've got some for next week.
Would you lead us in closing prayer?
All right, let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for the technology. Excuse me, the technology to be connected to those that are not in the room. Thank you for the connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Old Covenant, First Covenant, and the New Covenant, Second Covenant. And Jesus, we thank you for that new covenant in your blood that circumcises our hearts, and by the power of your Holy Spirit helps us be adherent to what none of your people previously could do. pray that you just continue to empower us as we go out and represent you to the world, that more people will be interested in coming to learn about you and becoming your people. We pray all this in the name of Christ. Amen.